In 1931, Stanislaus Joyce wrote to his older brother, James, a letter that echoed with many voices. "I cannot read your work in progress. The vague support you get from certain French and American critics I set down to pure snobbery. What is the meaning of that rout of drunken words? You want to show that you are a super clever Superman with a superstyle." It wasn't the younger sibling's first complaint, nor even the most bitter. As brother of the more famous Jim, he had spoken out far more abusively earlier, similarly obscure moments in the Joycean career. Nor was Stanny's the only such complaint. In fact, such allegations and dismissals would become more or less general. This time, the work in progress became, 1939, a book that has defeated most of its would-be readers wholly and all partially, but that same frustrated opprobrium had begun with, 1922, and in due time would discolor everything that Joyce wrote. To accept the general impeachment of James Joyce is never to no vast delight. The majority has ruled for a long time. Joyce is difficult, Prince of the Unintelligibles, outstanding Gertrude, and that's that, no further argument. If, out of sensitivity, out of respect, you find yourself reluctant to blame the artist himself, you could, if you wished, turn on the academics. Sneer at them. Well, they certainly took Joyce at his word when he said, "My work will keep the professors busy for 300 years. Indeed. Hammer them further, didn't they then make him exclusive, intensify his arcane reputation, isolate him from the common reader because they were hunting down all those recondite doctorates in his thickets? And, as every dog and Derrida knows, the more obscure the thesis the more the. However, why yield to either frustration or cynicism, especially in the face of such great art? Since Joyce believed that his writing both synthesized and transcended other disciplines, specifically painting and music, why not look for him somewhere over there? Indeed, why not wonder whether Joyce only needs a little pathfinding, a little extra scrutiny? There's a lot to be gained when you, set a thief to catch a thief. An artist from one discipline can refresh how we see a fellow artist from another. Sure on. Let us not forget that godhood means to Wagner infirmity and compromise, and manhood strength and integrity. Henry James remarked upon Sir Christopher Wren's insincere recesses and niches at St. Paul '*S. James Joyce attracted painters. Brancusi painted a portrait of the artist as an older man, one slender whirl and some thin tangential lines, prompting Joyce's father to say, "Well, Jim has changed a bit since I saw him." Matisse provided stunning illustrations for an edition of Ulysses, though by taking his inspiration from Homer he annoyed Joyce, who probably didn't stop to think about Matisse's language skills. And there was one other artist, admittedly minor, who, for those seeking to understand Joyce, made the greatest of all differences. In 1918, an English painter, Frank Budgeon, 1882 to 1971, met James Joyce at a party in Zurich. Both were aged 36, and within their first conversation Joyce responded to Budgeon's natural sensitivity and felt safe with him. Rare compliment, he then showed Budgeon his work in progress of the day, the first 3 chapters of, 4 years before the book would appear in print. If there can be a natural kinship between painters and writers, Budgeon, the perfect reader, proved it. To Joyce's difficult material he brought his own sense of how any artist must render life. In a memoir, 1934, he described the great modernist's prose from his own artistic vantage. It is like an impressionist painting. The shadows are full of color, the whole is built up out of nuances instead of being constructed in broad masses. Things are seen as immersed in a luminous fluid, color supplies the modeling and the total effect is arrived at through a countless number of small touches. Seen thus, Joyce's work changes forever. No longer do we have to read what multiple critics called tormented prose. The myriad disdainers, whose negatives ranged from vulgar and foul to psychic disintegration, they fail. As Budgeon saw him, Joyce's higher purpose gleams like dawn. Through Budgeon's lens, not only may we now excuse Joyce the dense layers of reference, often 6 deep in the use or placement of a single word, we may relish them. Instead of fighting him phrase by phrase, we can trust him image by image as we see one art relating to another, literature rendered as painting. It's like stumbling into a field of diamonds, hard, brilliant flashes of light everywhere. In short, Frank Budgeon alters James Joyce's state by making him a writer whom we see rather than merely read. That Joyce was ever thus can be discerned early. The first paragraph of his first generally published work, The Sisters, in 1914, contains this sentence: "A painting in itself, if he was dead, I thought, I would see the reflection of candles on the darkened blind, for I knew that 2 candles must be set at the head of a corpse." Every story in the collection offers similar illustrative prose. When she got outside, the streets were shining with rain and she was glad of her old brown raincloak, clay. The head of a man who has fallen lies in a dark medal of blood, grace. Or, straight from Renoir, she was a slim, growing girl, pale in complexion and with hay-colored hair. It's possible to pass off the many bright phrases in and 1916 as show, don't tell, the creative writing school ideal. The Impressionism doesn't truly kick in until, thereafter it dominates and does so in ways both brilliantly technical and artistically profound, and occasionally parodic. For example, in a technique vital to painting, the shift between light and shadow, Stephen Dedalus, under the sunny daylight of the most famous June morning in literature, walks along Sandymount Strand, with his eyes closed. Once the image is in place, literature then takes the meaning up and away, walking into eternity, thinks Stephen. And yet, when the book was published in February 1922, and was at the moment the most famous book in the world, that same Proteus chapter, with its now notorious ineluctable modality of the visible, was the downfall of so many would-be readers. Why didn't they ask Budgeon? Take the first of his 3 crucial remarks: it is like an impressionist painting. The shadows are full of color, the whole is built up out of nuances instead of being constructed in broad masses. Use that observation to interrogate a later chapter in The Wandering Rocks'. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Lunch has been taken, Hamlet has been dissected within the library, and another landscape with figures is about to be painted. We've already had strong hints of this kind of canvas. Stephen steps away from a crowded bathing place, a funeral proceeds across town, Mr. Bloom peregrinates among people and streets towards his lunch. Now, in Wandering Rocks, we are about to view the city as L.S. Lowry and his stick figures. Or the Breffels or a Verkamp, those low country scenes of teeming villages. Or a Renoir afternoon. Within the first few hundred words, we observe a grave and serious priest, who gives a blessing to a one-legged sailor, meets and greets the wife of an MP, and chats to 3 little schoolboys. Across the canvas strides a dancing teacher in silk hat, slate frockcoat with silk facings, white kerchief tie, lavender trousers, canary gloves and pointed patent boots. Next we see Mrs. McGuinness, stately, silver-haired, with a fine carriage. Like Mary, Queen of Scots. And on it goes, more schoolboys, satcheled this time, shopkeepers, a police constable, 2 unlabouring men lounging against the window of a pub, a bargeman with a hat of dirty straw. The book at this moment almost ceases to have characters, rather they become members of a painted day. In 1920, for Carlo Linati, the Italian translator of his play, 1918, Joyce produced the Linati schema, a breakdown of the chapter's 19 segments, in which many characters recur. He listed the chapter's concerns as objects, places, forces. Ulysses called the technique of the chapter a shifting labyrinth between 2 shores, and defined the organ of the piece as blood. All through the Wandering Rocks chapter the corpuscles of Dublin's lifeblood pulse along the veins and arteries of the city. In general, Joyce threw down many deliberate, almost sadistic challenges, not least to the formal, that is to say, sequential use of language. But if is Impressionism, it can't drag you back to its old ways. As such, it passes all Budgeon's tests, not least the whole is built up out of nuances instead of being constructed in broad masses. Few characters in most chapters receive great dramatic roles, and yet they all tell the story of the 16th of June 1904 in Dublin. Yeats wasn't meaning to condescend when he referred to the book's content as the vulgarity of a single Dublin day, he also meant the crowd. 20 years before Joyce was born, the American painter, Thomas Akins, 1844 to 1916, wrote to a friend, "In a big picture you can see what o'clock it is, afternoon or morning, if it's hot or cold, winter or summer, and what kind of people are there, and what they are doing, and why they are doing it. Akins, not an impressionist, rather a near-complete and Rembrandtish realist, might have been writing about all of, a great deal of and many if not most of the 18 chapters in. When Joyce published his two largest works, critical attention went to the inn and the dream capturing of. The former settled down as his book of the day, the latter his book of the night. All that dismay gave way to the desperation at the wake. This was truly beyond everything. Yet takes care of the rest of Budgeon's observations. The book behaves differently, same painter, different technique, yet again the whole is built up out of nuances instead of being constructed in broad masses. Budgeon may have thought that he was referring to, but there was already underway when he wrote his invaluable memoir. And that novel, if such it is truest of all to the third part of Budgeon's opinion. Things are seen as immersed in a luminous fluid. This is where Budgeon nails it. There is simply no point in trying to read by any conventional methods. Indeed, doing so would dishonor Joyce and his intention to capture the spirit's nocturnal mechanisms, as had the diurnal. Best to take that phrase of Budgeon's at its face value and immerse oneself in the book's fluid. When you read in the old way, even with conscious sound, the, as does, changes before your eyes. It becomes a dreamlike Book of the Dead, whose power inside Joyce's spirit was so great that he had no choice but to use a dismembered language. Joyce was putting these sentences down on the page long before he knew of the world's newest and widest used language, called a binary code of literature. But again, and at the risking of banging the drum too loud and too often, read it not as language, read it as, say, a gift of tongues, or as music, or as that benighted creature, the prose poem. And then as painting, and this time add abstract to the Impressionists. It's not just the sounds of the words, it's the shapes. Here are some examples of the text, plucked at random. Faber, 1975. The opening paragraph, River run, past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay. Can be a sweep of colour from the south of France. And who have we here? Jackson Pollock. The Fall, Bababad Elgarata Caminaran con Bruntonna, Ronchin Thuntravaron on scorn tu ordinantha nook, of a once wool-stray old pa is rettled early in bed and later on life down through all Christian minstrelsy. Let's have one more, the briefest of glimpses, a corner of a canvas and yet touchingly complete, my great blue bedroom, the air so quiet, scarce a cloud. In peace and silence. Taken together, this admittedly minuscule sample of 3 quotations is at least a sinew in Budgeon's argument. Finally, poetry is the magnifying glass of literature's art. Yeats called it hammering my thoughts into unity. Though he wrote so few, James Joyce's verses distill his painterly claim. Read, 1927, his collection of penny apples, he couldn't resist punning on, and you can see his brushstrokes. He travels after a winter sun, urging the cattle along a cold red road. Or, a birdless heaven, sea dusk, one lone star piercing the west. And, hell, he's almost pre-Raphaelite. A waste of waters ruthlessly sways and uplifts its weedy mane. In the Carpaccio room at the Venice Accademia, several gigantic canvases add up to nothing short of a massive literary work. Carpaccio could have called the collection, Venetian Life and Other Stories. Apply the same principles to Joyce and there aren't rooms enough, nor galleries. In the end it may all come down to the practical. Commentators have argued for love as the one dominant element in everything Joyce wrote. There has even been a thought that if all the typos and missteps in could ever have been corrected, the central word in the text would be love, and intentionally so. Perhaps, but light trumps it. Page by page almost, we are never too far from the sun or the moon or the candle or the lamp or the air itself as a light source. And with good reason. Throughout his life, Joyce suffered from poor and often painful eyesight. His eyes aged faster than he did, and by his mid-40s he had endured multiple surgical procedures. In today's terms, he'd probably qualify as legally blind. Did intensifying glaucoma impel him to his pen dancing, pointillistism? Deformity, too, has its place in art.